Good afternoon, everyone. Just before we start, I'm just going to introduce myself and just run through a brief statement with you all. So my name is Neil Hudson-Basing, and I'm the Corporate Events Manager for London South Bank University. Just before we start, I just want to read a bit of a statement to you just regarding the event. So the topic of vaccinations is incredibly current, hence hence the need for this event. And we are aware that there is mounting evidence regarding significant lower uptake of vaccines from people in BME communities compared to their white peers. This information is ever more concerning in the context that BME communities have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. Hence, it is important that we declare that our panel today is not proportionally representative of the BME communities that LSBU serves and the local community within which the institution resides. This event and panel were put together before wider reports of vaccine uptakes were released. Nevertheless, as an institution, we are committed to be active ensuring that our panels are representative, diverse and inclusive, and we are undertaking work to ensure that this is the case across our whole events offering and activity. We are actively engaged in changing the current structural inequalities that impact our BME peers. In terms of future events addressing these issues, we're excited to be working with Dr. Calvin Morley, Associate Professor of Nursing Research and Diversity in Care, to deliver a national event in the coming months focusing on vaccination hesitancy in BME nursing students. This is a collaboration between LSBU's Institute of Health and Social Care and Marcus Riddle, Head of Vaccinations for NHS England, and Professor Mark Radford, Deputy Chief Nursing Officer for England. Additional events and activity will follow. With the focus of this event being solely on vaccines, I'd now like to hand over to my colleague, Dean Woodhouse, LSBU's Senior Corporate Events Officer, who has curated today's event to set the scene and introduce our esteemed panel, who are here to share their knowledge, expertise, and research outcomes. Dean, over to you.
Thank you, Neil. And yes, welcome to COVID-19 vaccine. Who can we trust? My name is Dean Woodhouse, and I am the Senior Corporate Events Officer here at London South Bank University, as well as today's host. For those who are not familiar with Zoom, as an attendee, if you look at the taskbar at the bottom of your screen, you'll see several options. You are able to use the chat box to share your thoughts or facts, as well as ask questions using the Q&A function. Do keep an eye on the chat box, as we'll be posting information in there during today's event, including key messages and practical takeaways provided by our speakers. If you do have any questions during the event, do pop them in the Q&A box. We like to hold all questions until the panel session at the end, but if your question is directed to a specific speaker during the event, they will be able to answer the question after their presentations via the Q&A box. We will not be using the raise hand icon for this event. Before we start, I'd like to deliver our respect and dignity statement. Everyone speaking at or attending an LSBU event, whether in person or virtually, should be treated with respect, dignity, and courtesy. LSBU operates an environment built on equality, inclusion, and acceptance. We value contributions, feedback, and comments, and wish to create a space for sharing, learning, celebrating, and bringing communities together. LSBU does not tolerate any form of bullying, abuse, harassment, or discrimination. Inappropriate behavior, including behavior that potentially impacts or contradicts LSBU's reputation and values, will be treated seriously and acted upon. Anyone exhibiting any example of the above behavior will be also removed from this webinar. We want our events to be enjoyable and warm experience for all. Thank you for adhering to these guidelines. We have a packed event for you today, so I'll hand over to our first speaker. Delivering vaccinations, a public health perspective, we have Professor of Health Promotion for LSBU, Professor Jane Wills.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming to this session. My name is Professor Jane Wills. I'm a professor of public health and health promotion, and I'm going to give a very broad overview of the issue of vaccinations to introduce this session today. Now, vaccinations have been rated by many magazines and scientific journals as one of the top 10 innovations in the world. And you can see it ranked there alongside the internet, alongside refrigeration, the telephone, and so on. And the reason for that is obviously that it reduces the burden of infectious disease and reduces the complications arising from those diseases, and thereby in the modern era reduces antibiotic prescribing, which is extremely important that we lower that so that we reduce antibiotic resistance. It isn't new. Vaccinations have a long, long history. And you see here a whole timeline of the types of interventions in diseases that vaccinations have tried to address. Starting perhaps in 1796, although it's not the first example, but it's the most well-known example of Edward Jenner inoculating cowpox to reduce smallpox. And the remarkable success that occurred in the 18th and early 19th century from that kind of vaccination against smallpox, which was killing maybe 500,000 Europeans every year. And although it only was fatal in about 30% of cases, actually his discovery that using the attenuated virus from cowpox was remarkably successful. So vaccination not only protects against disease, but it is also part of what we might call a social contract. It's an index of social responsibility. And this particular pandemic has really pointed to the importance of looking out for others. It not only protects yourself, but it protects others. And we can see the current debate about does the current vaccines, and my colleagues will talk about this, actually reduce the likelihood of transmission? And at what point might we get herd immunity? In England, we have a particular oversight of vaccinations. It's provided by the Department of Health and Social Care, the Joint Committee, an independent task force, and the vaccines are regulated by the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. In England, or in the UK, vaccination is not mandatory, and this is an important point of consideration and will be debated in the coming months. Now, one of the issues that's raised today, and which was alluded to by my colleague Neil in the introduction, is that there are a number of people who are what are called hesitant, or we might call reluctant, to accept vaccinations. In populations as a whole, there were people who will always accept a vaccination and people who, for various reasons, are likely to always refuse vaccinations, whether it's for their children, themselves, or currently. And there are a whole host of reasons that research has pointed to. Some are about beliefs in natural protection. Some may be reluctant to accept a vaccination because they do not perceive themselves at risk. It's those people in the middle who are hesitant or reluctant that we need to consider at the moment. And in all the research on vaccinations that have taken place up to this point, there are what we call the 3 C's. There are the issues that are concerned with convenience, both the availability of vaccines, the availability of the health personnel to deliver the vaccinations, and access and convenience issues about, for example, timing of appointments, and as we see currently, the simple location of the vaccination hubs and how close they are to the individual. Secondly, there are the issues that are called complacency issues. These relate to the individual's perception of risk and their likelihood of getting disease, their perceived susceptibility. And alongside that, also their beliefs about the perceived severity of the disease. And then there are the issues of confidence. And there are a whole host of issues associated with that. The concerns that individuals may have about side effects, about the development of the vaccine and safety, about its constituents. It's about its suitability for individuals and their particular situation, whether it's their allergies or people who are women who are pregnant, and the efficacy of the vaccine against the particular disease. And my colleagues will be talking about those issues later on this afternoon. Now, with COVID, there are some particular issues that we can see emerging about what influences the decisions that people make about taking up the COVID vaccine. In contrast to perhaps the decision-making that took place maybe 10 years ago or 20 years ago when Andrew Wakefield conducted his study that achieved so much notoriety about the link between the MR vaccine and autism, we now have social media, and the widespread use of social media enables particular views to be shared. And I've just put on the slide there the particular tweet from Trump about that Wakefield study, which was liked by 18,000 people. We also have another influence on the uptake of COVID vaccine is about the influence of gatekeepers, and similar to social media, but people who hold particular sway, whether it's faith leaders within communities, celebrities, footballers, politicians, and so on. And the influence that they have, both in order to promote the uptake of vaccines, but also in certain cases against that. And then a particular feature within this pandemic and the reluctance which was raised by my colleague in the introduction by certain BAME communities about trust and the trust and credibility that people have in the vaccination process and in vaccines themselves. The pandemic has exposed, and our research has shown, a real decline in trust within governments, both and associated, therefore, with the vaccination process, partly due to changes in messaging about the protocols and the dosing. But this issue of trust and credibility is being actively addressed within communities. And most councils in urban areas are having the conversation about the vaccine take-up. So finally, there are some messages that in public health we are seeking to address, and these derive from our existing research. We have to address the health literacy of populations and think about how we are communicating and how that message is being understood, and use the messages that the learnings that we have about health literacy to design better messaging. Because of the decline in trust, and also because of the uncertainty of some of the evidence, we have to be clear about what we know and what we don't know. We need to build trust, and we need to have those dialogues with all sorts of communities who may be hesitant, and individual groups and groups who may be hesitant. And we need to promote vaccination as a social contract. It's not only that it protects you, but it also protects others. In the early stages of the pandemic, we saw social responsibility as one of the key principles in people's behavior. As the year has gone by, perhaps this has declined a little, and in relation to vaccination, it's one of the key messages that we wish to promote. Dean, I know that you have a poll at this particular point. Thank you. I hope that the audience can see the poll, and it is asking you whether you regard COVID-19 as a serious disease. And there are 4 options. Yes, it's very serious. Yes, it's fairly serious for some people. It's not very serious for someone like me, or it's not serious at all. And perhaps you'd all like to vote at this particular point, and then Dean will share the results. So of our audience, which is several hundred people, most people are regarding it as very serious. That's 73%. And 24% of you regard it as fairly serious for some people. And a small minority, not very serious for someone like me. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Iman, who's going to talk about actually those results and the seriousness and severity of COVID-19. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jane, for your presentation today. Our next speaker will be presenting what are vaccines and an overview of COVID-19 and vaccine development. Let me introduce LSBU's Associate Professor in Biomedical Science, Dr. Iman Aleem.
Hello. Yeah, it's my pleasure actually to present to you today. And can you see the yellow screen?
Yes, we can see that, Iman. Yep.
Okay. So my name is Iman Aleem, and I am an associate professor in biomedical sciences at the School of Applied Sciences, Division of Human Sciences. And I'm very pleased to participate in this event today and hopefully to contribute some my knowledge in this field. I am a molecular biologist by training, and the title of my presentation is What are Vaccines? An Overview of COVID-19 and Vaccine Development. Dean, would you please show the poll first?
Sorry, 2 seconds. I'm just getting the poll up for you. So.
Okay.
Yep, there it is.
So my poll or my question to you, do you trust vaccines as effective agents against infectious diseases? Some of you will think yes, some no. If you don't think they are effective tools, we might want to think why. Write the reasons in the chat, please. Let's start, please. Okay, so we have like 92% said yes and 7% said no. Okay, thank you for this. Here is an overview of the structure of my presentation, starting with the definition of vaccines. What are vaccines? And we'll show you 2 examples that prove that vaccines are the most effective tools in controlling infectious diseases. We'll talk a little bit about COVID-19, the virus which causes COVID-19 called SARS-CoV-2. What does it do to our bodies? And some statistics of today about the COVID-19 status in the world. And lastly, or finally, I'm going to talk about the different vaccine production platforms and timeline. What are vaccines? A vaccine is a product or a medicine that is introduced into the body to train the body's immune system to fight a specific disease that it hasn't encountered before. So before we talk about vaccine, it helps us to see how the immune system works, because actually vaccines harness the natural activity of the immune system. The immune system has a part called innate immunity, which is the first line defense, it's non-specific, and an adaptive immunity, which is acquired or specific. The immune system can be activated by antigens. These could be like proteins or polysaccharides or glycoproteins on the surface of the bacteria and viruses, and these trigger the immune response. As you see on the right-hand side, you can see that's a virus and there are certain proteins at the top. We call these antigens, and the antibodies will have to be exactly the right shape of the antigen so that it fits together like a lock and a key. something like this. If you can see this, you can, this would be the antibody and this is the antigen. It just fits like this, okay? So this slide shows you a graph that at the x-axis down here, you see number of years from 1980 through to 2017. On the y-axis, you see the number of cases, okay, of certain infectious diseases like measles and pertussis. And on this side of the axis, you show the percentage of vaccination or vaccine coverage of measles, polio, and diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, and how the relationship is inverse. So from 1980, there was a vaccine coverage of about 20%, increasing up to about 85% in 2017. So I showed you in the last slide how vaccines helped the reduction, dramatic reduction of measles and pertussis along the years. This is another example of the polio vaccine that shows, it was in the 1950s in America. Here shows lines of people queuing to get the vaccine, the polio vaccination during the 1950s. And there were about 20,000 cases of polio per year. Then in the 1960s, this dropped down to about just 33,000 per year. And then 1979, it dropped about 10 cases of polio per year in the US, thanks of the polio vaccine. This shows how the children suffer from polio and the iron lungs machine that helped the children to breathe when their lung muscles were paralyzed. So here's a little bit about COVID-19 as a disease. So it is caused by severe acute respiratory, it's called the severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2. For short, we call it SARS-CoV-2. And the genome or the genetic material of the virus is an RNA, what we call an RNA. So the genome could be a DNA for viruses or an RNA. So that of the SARS-CoV-2 is an RNA virus. It belongs to the coronaviruses that have crown-like spikes, what you see here on the red parts on the surface. And the genetic sequence of the SARS-CoV-2 was published on 11th of January 2020 in China. And this is about like 2 months, less than 2 months from the time when the epidemic started. This shows how the science, the acceleration in scientific results and research could impact the length of time that in which we develop medicines and vaccines for the whole world population. This SARS-2 genome has 80% similarity with the RNA genome of the SARS-CoV. So there was another SARS coronavirus before, and this, our current coronavirus shares about 80% similarity in the RNA genome. This also helped acceleration of the research towards vaccination. Some statistics about COVID-19 as of today. So these figures here show you one in gray, that is today. The orange color is from the 7th of December, and the blue color shows the number of cases in April 2020, so like 10 months ago. So the overall number of cases increased with time from April to December to February 2021. There is a almost similar percentage of the number of recovered cases if you compare these two. And the number of deaths is little in comparison of recovered cases. What I'm going to show you now on the right-hand side are statistics of today from the Worldometers that shows there are almost 81 million cases in the world. Closed cases means that cases which had already an outcome. 78.5% or 78.5 million, which are 97% already recovered or discharged from hospitals, and about 2,300,000 deaths which accounts to about 3% of the total. There are still 25,800,000 cases currently infected, 99.6% mild condition, and 0.4% serious or critical condition. So what does SARS-CoV-2 do to our body? The virus, this is, if you look to these two blue boxes, these are cells in the lungs, for example, and these are receptors. The receptors are the doors that open the door for the virus to enter the cell. And so the virus will bind to the receptors like this, as you see here, will enter the cell, will replicate. This will trigger certain immune cells. I'm not going to go into details. Certain immune cells to the first line of defense, to come by and start secreting certain chemicals that will attract or recruit additional immune cells, releasing other chemicals, and so on. And then we have two outcomes. If there is a healthy immune system, what will happen? This will result in clearance of the virus and minimal lung damage, resulting in recovery, which is what is happening with most of the people who recover. If there is a defective immune system or underlying conditions or something, then this could result in further accumulation of immune cells in the lungs, causing overproduction of what we call pro-inflammatory chemicals, causing damage to the lung, as well as this cytokine storm will circulate to other organs, leading to multi-organ damage. Some of the organs that are impacted by this cytokine storm and this multi-organ damage include the vascular system, the lungs, resulting in pneumonia with acute respiratory distress syndrome, kidneys, you will find proteins in the urine, blood in the urine, abnormal liver function, acute myocardial injury and chronic cardiovascular damage. In the intestine, microbial infection, diarrhea, severe acute ulcerative colitis, and in the brain might lead to a stroke. So this here shows you the schematic structure of the key structural proteins as target antigens for various vaccine production. So currently, as you see in this yellow box here, there are about, or it's not really currently, that was 3 months ago, 201 vaccine candidates active globally, of which 45 are in clinical phase and 156 in preclinical phase. This here shows you the structure of the COVID-19 virus, or the SARS-CoV-2, and it shows you the structural proteins like the spike proteins on the that is the glycoproteins on the surface, the membrane proteins, envelope proteins, nucleocapsid proteins, and the RNA genome is inside. Spike protein is the major target antigen for most of the platforms, the vaccine production platforms. They can do replicating viral vectors, non-replicating recombinant proteins, RNA proteins, vaccines, I mean. There is also another way, which we include the whole variant as an attenuated, live attenuated vaccine or an inactivated vaccine. This is just a list of all the possible platforms for vaccine production. And this slide here shows you that in the traditional way, the vaccine production could take up from 3 maybe to 9 or 10 years, because there are so many steps involved, starting from the discovery and target validation, through the preclinical stages, the manufacturing developmental phases, phase 1 clinical studies that has a low number of participants, usually healthy volunteers, and this is for the safety of the new product, through phase 2 testing safety and immunogenicity with like 100+ individuals, and phase 3 finally testing the safety, efficacy, and regulatory approval with thousands of or hundreds and thousands of participants from several countries, and then this will lead to the regulatory review. My fellow speakers will show you why in COVID, or speak about why COVID-19 was produced in a much less time frame There are we already have a lot of knowledge from previous SARS-CoV, for example, infection. I will conclude with this slide. The world is temporarily closed, and this impacts our lives. So I hope that vaccines are which are the most effective tools in fighting infectious diseases, and COVID-19 vaccine is no different. We hope by a few months from now that we could open the world again. COVID-19 is not the first pandemic in history, and likely not the last. Science has largely eradicated previous pandemics, so why not COVID-19 as well? And of course, our take-home message is stay home, wear masks, observe social distancing, even though there are vaccines and vaccination going on. But let us just observe the guidelines until we can open the world again. And thank you very much. And I apologize for the issues that happened to my computer. Thank you.
Thank you, Iman. Yeah, that was just unfortunate, but glad you was able to get through the presentation. Your computer didn't die down during the presentation after that. Our next presentation is entitled Developing and Delivering Safe and Effective Vaccines. Allow me to introduce the Director for New Medicines and Data Policy from the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry, Dr. Brian Dean.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Dean, for the introduction, and thanks to my previous speaker colleagues who've led into this quite nicely. I'd like to remind everybody that the scientific community around the world at least believes that vaccines have contributed more to improving global public health over the last 100 years than any other intervention than clean water and sanitation. And for more information, I would suggest people look at the WHO, the World Health Organization website, where there's a lot of information on all sorts of vaccines and how they're delivered around the world. And also our own Department of Health and Social Care website, which has a lot of information on the vaccines that are available in the UK. Here in the UK, deaths and disability due to diseases like smallpox and polio that have already been mentioned are now very rare thanks to vaccines. I would continue by talking a little bit about the speed. And as Eamon mentioned, we've been working on coronaviruses since the SARS and MERS outbreaks, which fortunately didn't result in a pandemic. SARS reared its head in Asia in 2002, so that's quite a few years. The release of the genetic data, as she mentioned, on the SARS-CoV-2 virus helped focus the research as we looked for either repurposing therapeutics or developing new vaccines. And as you heard, there are a number of vaccines approved now around the world, but also still a lot more being developed in case we need a range of vaccines. The other angles on how we've managed to do it so quickly are that having focused that research on the spike protein that was mentioned as the main antigen, combining with the approaches to SARS and MERS, there was also a huge amount of extra manpower and unprecedented collaboration around the world between researchers in academia, governments and industry to prioritize vaccines for COVID. And in addition to that, things that are normally done sequentially one after the other have been carried out side by side, so that we've saved some time. And all that meant that COVID vaccines were developed very quickly, but that all the normal processes and standards and data collection were adhered to. At the same time, the final steps, as was mentioned, the clinical trials, which are absolutely critical to demonstrating safety and effectiveness for a new medicine or vaccine, were carried out in the same sort of numbers as was mentioned, small numbers in phase 1 to just check how the volunteers respond and to ensure that they're tolerated sufficiently well, and then gradually increasing the numbers to look for actual efficacy in phase 2, and then the phase 3 studies that actually statistically prove the efficacy while still testing for safety. In this case, in trials involving volunteers from tens of thousands of patients, over 40,000 in at least 2 of the vaccines that have been approved. So that was all also carried out with more speed by combining to some extent the phase 2 and 3 studies, so that we were not doing them in sequential step-like fashion, and being able to research these around the world in volunteers in North America, Brazil, across Europe and Africa, meant that we could recruit those numbers quicker than we might have done if we'd done it in one country. In addition to that, of course, the independent regulator has a good sight of every new medicine or vaccine. In the UK, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, MHRA, in Europe, the EMA, and in North America, the FDA. And they all give guidance on the design of clinical trials, on what to measure. And then the regulator reviews all the data before approving it for use. And in this case, the regulators, particularly the MHRA, were reviewing data on what's quite a new approach in terms of being a rolling review. So they were looking at data as it was being compiled, rather than waiting for the whole dossier to be put together. So that also helped us to speed things up. There's a point about a large trial like this, that when it's in the blind phase, the researchers can't see the data until it's complete, but there may be an independent data and safety monitoring committee for large studies, and there are usually in interim analyses that committee can look at to make sure things are going as expected, and they have the option to stop the trial if either there's a safety issue or if the efficacy looks even better than was expected. So that's just another approach to making sure that these trials are conducted as safely as possible. And as was mentioned, this whole process of discovering, developing, and doing the clinical trials normally takes several years. In this case, we were into the clinical research, and fortunately, the early trials proved positive. So the first 2 vaccines that got through were approved on the data that was developed in that fairly rapid time frame. I would note that although there are a large number of vaccine candidates in research at the moment, at least 2 have been halted because they weren't effective enough. So as usual, there's always some failures in this sort of approach to developing new medicines. And finally, the manufacturing, and I would remind everybody that this pandemic is required a response on an unprecedented scale. We're looking to try and vaccinate the whole population as fast as possible, but you can't make that much vaccine in no time at all. So vaccines are made in batches, and for each batch, you have to go through the process of making the vaccine, getting all the raw materials together, running the process, purifying it, that's isolating as far as possible the active ingredient and removing impurities and the unwanted bits and pieces that are left. Then, having purified it, you formulate it, and that may include adding an adjuvant, which would ensure that the vaccine remains stable in the vials and maximizes the immune response when it's given. Once it's formulated in quantity, it's then bottled into vials or syringes. And at that point, the batch testing goes on. Every batch has to be fully tested. It's actually tested during the process as well as right at the end, so that the conditions and the processes are monitored during manufacturing, and then at the end is tested before it's released by both the company and the regulator for each batch to ensure that we have a consistent quality, safety and efficacy from batch to batch, so that every batch is as good as every other batch. And only then do you ship it to the patients. So that's a little bit of a summary of the process. I'd like to just draw your attention to some social media content that we as the ABPI have developed in general about vaccines, but it applies equally to the COVID vaccines that we have. This is all available on our website, and you'll see it if you look around on Twitter and other social media platforms. So there's a basic website that we run with the content on it. Every vaccine is tested on thousands, and vaccines are monitored over their lifetime, not just up to approval, but after approval by the MHRA to ensure that any safety signals are spotted and picked up and acted on. And finally, the process of developing is also run as a short video. It as quickly as possible without compromising any of the safety and quality standards that we always have to adhere to. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian, for your presentation. Our penultimate presentation focuses on the rehabilitation and recovery following serious illness related to COVID-19. Let me introduce Senior Lecturer of Adult Nursing at LSBU, Alison James.
Hi everyone. I'm a research assistant in the COVID research that I'll be now presenting. For many people, COVID-19 is a mild condition which does not require hospital admission. However, there are some people who develop a more severe illness and require breathing support in hospital with or without admission to an intensive care unit. When we are thinking about why COVID vaccination is important, we can be discussing the experience of those people who have been critically ill with COVID-19. At London South Bank University, we are currently undertaking research relating to the recovery of patients who have been severely unwell with COVID-19 and have required breathing support in an intensive care unit. This research is led by Professor Suzanne Bench at LSBU, in collaboration with Central London Community Hospital NHS Trust and NHS Sequel, which is part of Epsom and St Helier NHS Trust, and it's been funded by Burdett Nursing Trust. The participants we have so far interviewed have been in hospital recovering from COVID for months. From their initial presentation in A&E to being discharged from hospital following rehabilitation, our study participants spend on average 4 months in hospital recovering from COVID. So far, we have recruited male and female participants aged 48 to 74 years old from varying ethnicities and socioeconomic levels. To date, we've virtually interviewed 12 people, and we are hoping to interview about 25 participants overall. The range of symptoms that our participants continue to experience post-discharge does range and can include ongoing fatigue, headaches, mobility issues, and respiratory concerns, including lung damage. The neurological impact experienced cannot be underestimated. We're having participants who are experiencing confusion, memory loss, and unable to concentrate for sustained periods of time. Depending on where their hospital admission was in the pandemic timeline itself, depends on what support was available for them on discharge. And we do actually have some patients who were from the very first March time. Discharge processes have changed, and the more knowledge we have acquired about COVID, this has obviously impacted on that. Our initial findings are showing that there are similarities between COVID patients that are also seen with other critically ill patients. So the participants that we've talked about have experienced traumatic dreams while they were in ITU, or hallucinations, as one patient has called it, as these are dreams that you cannot wake up from. These hallucinations are a distressing time for most of the participants, and I've got examples of this being chained to a bed, seeing dead bodies within their dreams, and even experiences that they had died themselves or others had who were close to them. At these times, these dreams feel real until they wake up from their medical-induced coma and try and work out what was reality and what was that dream. However, I did have one patient who dreamt that they'd won £15,000, and when they woke up, they were a bit annoyed that that was just a dream. Like with other ITU patients, they are using diaries. So this has been reported as helping the patients make sense as what happened to them during their time in the coma. COVID patients do not have families to visit them whilst they're in ITU. And also they have limited contact with when they're in hospital, which is very different to usual times. They are reliant on technology, so things like phones and tablets for communicating with their family and loved ones. They describe this use of technology a lifeline, connecting them with their loved ones from the outside world, but also a hindrance. This is due to the volume of messages they're receiving on a daily basis from family and friends, and not having the concentration to be able to keep up with that volume. When patients are discharged from hospital, we are seeing that they are taking longer to recover from COVID, requiring additional needs and having less resources being made available to them. This includes how they will access the services required as part of their recovery process. Some appointments are held virtually, which means patients need to ensure they have sufficient technology at home for this appointment. Some people are attending appointments at hospital or multiple appointments over multiple hospital sites and reporting that they're experiencing chronic fatigue for days after. Some people are able to buy their care to aid their recovery. This includes the hospital equipment, so thinking about rails if they have stairs in their house, shower chairs, and also they have carer support to assist their personal needs. So think about showering and toileting. Some patients are still unsteady on their feet, so they do need to make sure that they have someone there to stop them from falling. And they also have care to give their partners a break for looking after them. Other people are not able to afford this, showing the widening health gap and inequality of provision. There are examples of people recovering at home alone, relying on their own community to assist them with their needs if available. Some people do have their own garden, which has helped with their recovery to do their exercises set by physio. However, we do have others who have not had access to their outside of their apartment due to broken lifts and are unable to take the stairs. We are also seeing the financial impact for these patients. Some were financially stable, retired with a financial buffer prior to becoming unwell with COVID, and therefore they did not have to consider going back to work. However, some people are experiencing tiredness during the recovery from COVID, and this is preventing them from going back to work. When interviewed at 6 months, some were still unable to return to work, and one person is 10 months and still nowhere near going back to work. These people have real concerns as to when they will return, in what capacity, and whether their job will be available for them after being sick for a long period of time. If they lose their job, how hard will it be to obtain a new job with their new health issues? For some people, they do need to go back to work. There's no financial buffer, and they're scared of how they can psychologically go back with the fear of catching COVID again. They feel they've lost their self-confidence and are not the person they used to be, and they're trying to discover who this new person is that they've become. The NHS have been going that extra mile while patients have been in hospital, which has aided the psychological support throughout their recovery. Some people would not be able to recognise the staff on the street due to the PPE that they've been wearing whilst they were caring for them, but they could recognise them from their eyes. There are examples of ITU staff wheeling a patient outside with all their various lines and tubes because they wanted to see the sky, the patient who wanted a can of lemonade, or the nurse who bought flowers and chocolates for the patient's wife on her birthday and organised their first meeting since being admitted to hospital. This has all helped with the psychological recovery overall. So this has been a snapshot of some of the initial findings from our COVID study. We're still currently recruiting and interviewing our patients who have been severely unwell with COVID-19. Although some of our findings show similarities with other patients who are recovering from from critical illness, what our study will show is an understanding of what will specifically make the difference when those patients are recovering from COVID-19. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Ali, for your presentation. And our last presentation, our final presentation today, is covering what are the views of the clinically vulnerable and their healthcare team regarding COVID-19 vaccination. Let me introduce Professor of Kidney Care at LSBU, Professor Nicola Thomas.
Thank you very much, Dean, for inviting me. Just before I start, I'd just like to answer a question that's been in the chat. Why were we hearing about long COVID? I think the answer to that is really for everybody who's taking part today to really understand the impact that the vaccine might have. And we hear about people in hospital who are critically ill, but actually maybe the people joining today are not that familiar with the long-term impact that COVID might have. So I'm here today to talk about the views of the clinically vulnerable. I'm a kidney nurse. I'm a professor at the university. And I'm talking about the views of the clinically vulnerable, those people who are living with kidney disease, and also the healthcare team who are looking after them. So firstly, a little bit about kidney disease and why that's important, really as an example of people who are clinically vulnerable. So kidney disease affects around 6% of the adult population, and of those, around 66,000 adults have dialysis, meaning a kidney machine, or have received a kidney transplant. Now, I'm very privileged to be part of what we call the kidney community, and the kidney community comes together. We have patient organisations and staff organisations. And on the right side of the screen, the logos at the bottom show the fantastic charity called Kidney Care UK, which is a national charity that supports people living with kidney disease. And the National Kidney Federation is a group, it's an umbrella organisation for the kidney patient associations at local level. We also have professional organisations. So we have the Association of the Nephrology Nurses, and I'm on the executive board of that association. We have the British Renal Society, and I'm Deputy Vice President for Education of that society. We also have the Renal Association. So to explain why people with kidney disease are important in terms of vaccination priority, just to be clear, so the people who are having or receiving dialysis or have had a kidney transplant, they're in priority group 4. So they're being vaccinated at the moment, and they're termed clinically extremely vulnerable. And everybody else who's got kidney disease is in group 6. So hopefully they'll be vaccinated sometime in March, we think. So they'll be vaccinated alongside the people who are aged 16 to 65, who are in the at-risk group. So whenever we have a particular crisis, let's say, in clinical care, as we did with the pandemic back in March, we come together as a community to try and understand what matters to people and to try and do something about it. And back in December, just before Christmas, when the vaccines were approved, then we decided as a community to come together within 3 work streams. So you'll see here there was one work stream around the delivery of the vaccine, another work stream around information for both staff and patients, and also a work stream around data and research. So I'm going to focus now on vaccine information, in other words, answering questions that people had if they were either living with kidney disease or they were staff members. So the first thing we did was we tried to find out what did people think about the vaccine if they were a member of staff. And under the auspices of the Association of Nephrology Nurses, we sent a survey. So the survey went by email to the members of those associations and also by social media. And we got over 500 responses. And you'll see there that most people were nursing staff looking after people with kidney disease. And there were a variety of others, including allied health professionals, doctors and others. And at that time, in mid-January, about 70% of staff had received one vaccine. 20% hadn't received a vaccine because they hadn't been offered a vaccine or they couldn't make the time of the appointment. But around 9% at that time said they did not wish to have the vaccine. So of course, we're very interested in why that was. And you'll see there the four main reasons why people wished not to have the vaccine were around safety, testing and side effects, around fertility, because I'm sure you're aware that a lot of the workforce particularly is female, younger females, allergy, and also people were concerned if they'd had COVID, as many NHS staff had, what about antibodies, and then having the vaccine as well. So what we did was, this slide shows on the left the website that shows all the information resources for people either caring for people with kidney disease or people living with kidney disease. And you'll see that there's one tab that says COVID-19 vaccination. So what we tried to do was really answer people's concerns, answer people's questions. And you'll see here that I've focused particularly here on fertility. So with fertility, we had issues around, sorry, I'm just moving my screen so I can see it. So firstly, a strong statement to suggest there's no evidence to say that COVID-19 vaccine has any impact on fertility. The claims that there is an impact are speculative and not supported by data. There's no biologically plausible mechanism by which a vaccine would affect fertility. And then we stated or included a statement by the experts, by the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecology. So when you have time, you can have a look at that. So that's what we did around staff information, and that information has been freely available for a couple of weeks now. With regards to patients, we knew that the patient organisations had been answering questions right since the beginning of when we knew vaccines had been approved. And they do that online. They have help desks so people can ring up if they're not IT literate. And they also had webinars. And the first of the webinar you'll see there was on the 29th of January. And they had, I attended, I think there were almost 400 participants. But what we knew from a staff perspective was that it was actually important for us to think about the questions that patients had and then write something together within our community that would answer those questions. So if, for example, any of you watching are more junior healthcare professionals, actually you might have had very difficult questions from patients, and it was a way of helping you answer. The other thing is that I asked somebody within the group particularly about, what would they like to see? What would they like to happen next in terms of answering people's questions? And you'll see this gentleman wrote me a quote here about actually if you're somebody living with a long-term condition, living with kidney disease, you want to see long-term how effective this vaccine is going to be. So this is what we did. We had a specific site on the webpage about vaccine information. You'll see here there was a particular section on guidance for staff. And we developed a document that answers all these different questions. So if you're a healthcare professional and patients come to you and ask you any of those questions, there's some information there on how you might answer. And some of them have been very difficult for staff. Which vaccine is best for me? So some patients will be saying, well, should I wait for the Oxford vaccine? What about the Pfizer one? And actually, for people with kidney disease, the answer is the best one is the one that you're offered first. If you're offered it, this is the best one. A lot of people living with kidney disease are very concerned about the side effects, particularly if they're having immunosuppression. So that would be a very important question that we would guide health professionals in giving a good answer. Who should I trust? What happens if patients ask, have you had the vaccine yourself? How might you answer, particularly if you yourself are hesitant? So to summarise, I think what I have learned, and I hope everybody's learned from this webinar today, is that it's so important to listen to each other, to listen why people might be vaccine hesitant, and actually to respect each other's views. Maybe go away and ask yourself, what is the truth about the vaccines? We've heard some truth today. Maybe we have to consider, well, who do we trust? Do we trust the WhatsApp message that's been sent by a neighbour that I hardly know? Or do I trust more senior members of my team? Or do I trust the regulatory authority? What are the risks and benefits of having the vaccine? And my colleague Jane mentioned this at the beginning. It's not just about you as an individual, but also it's about your family, your friends. Are they at risk of, what are their risks of getting COVID, and what are their risks of having the vaccine? And finally, those of you who are healthcare professionals, to think of your colleagues. So my last slide is really going back to the statement that was made right at the beginning. And when I knew I was going to give this presentation, I was very conscious about the impact that this webinar might have, particularly to those who are of Black, Asian, minority ethnic heritage. So I asked this fantastic colleague of mine, who's Della Idowu, who's the chief executive of an organisation called Gift of Living Donation that promotes living donation, organ donation in people of Black heritage. And I asked her, well, what would you like your message to be today? So I'm not going to say her words because I don't want to represent her, but I'd just like to leave with her words as my final conclusion. Thank you. So thank you very much, Dean. Maybe you'd like to have the poll now as well, please.
Yep.
Yes, thank you very much, Dean. So I think from that poll, it very much reflected, oh dear, it's gone. I think it was 10%. Oh yes, so 10% would say no and 18% are hesitant. And I think that probably reflects generally, certainly what we've seen within kidney care. Maybe we didn't see quite 10% saying no, but certainly the people who are still hesitant about having the vaccine, that's reflected in the poll here today. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki, for your presentation. And just going to open up the panel discussion now. So I'd like to ask all panelists to switch on your cameras and microphones. Before we get started, I just wanted to say thank you very much for your questions today. We've got so many questions and we're trying our best to get through as many as possible in this short time that we've got left. And if we can't get through all the questions, then we will look to answer the questions after the event through post communications. There was a few questions in the chat, but unfortunately won't be able to get through them just because it's just a bit lost in that sort of area. So we're just going to focus on the Q&A box. So for the first question, I've got a question from Steve, who asked, do you think that the sensational headline reporting the vaccine issues in some of the media, e.g., example about the report of the AstraZeneca is only 10% effective against the South African variant, is dangerous and is likely to deter more people from accepting the vaccine. So who would like to address that one? Say Brian first.
Yes, I think there have been various rather sensational headlines at various points during this, not only in this country, and one or two of them have turned out to be rather misleading. So I think it is unhelpful. I don't think we know the precision of that data on the South African variant yet. There's a small study that suggests it's not as effective in preventing mild disease, but it still appears to be effective at preventing more severe disease. So I think we need to know more about that. There are not very many cases in the UK so far with the South African variant, but obviously the mutations as we go forward will be a concern. We may need more vaccines specific to the variants as they get more different, possibly, but at the moment, the majority of what is in front of us seems to be prevented by one or more of the vaccines we have. So we don't know everything yet. We're still very early in a pandemic and we're learning new stuff all the time. So I think that's really where we are. And I don't think sensational headlines particularly help at all.
Definitely not, no. It's one of those things of something new comes up and then it's just trying to create information that's not there at the moment. So it's just best to wait out, I believe, in that sense. So that's a good point to make, Brian. Does anyone else want to jump on that point or could move on to another question? No? Okay. So I got a question from Santia who's asked, I wondered if the panel were aware of the reasons for hesitancy in BMA communities, BAME community, sorry. This may also help shape strategy. BAME people have a long history of poor medical treatment, high mortality rates in BME women, but for example, research shows BME staff in the NHS pushed to COVID-19 onwards, disproportionately compared to their white counterparts. Maron Sims, who experimented early gynecology practice on Black women without anesthetic, etc., etc. So it's a long question. Sorry for butchering half of that. Who would like to answer that question? Jane?
Yes, I think I hesitated because I'm not from those communities. However, I am part of a group that's doing that research, and I have spoken to my colleague Kevin Fenton at Public Health England. There is no doubt that BME communities have been disproportionately affected by this pandemic, and the reasons for that are many, but they relate primarily to structural reasons, about overexposure to the violence, about difficulties of isolating and so on. And the concerns about the vaccine are, as Nikki's colleague so beautifully put in that quote, related to historical distrust. And there is clear evidence, and it's very articulated in the conversations that councils are having. And there is an excellent one that Westminster City Council put on that's on their website, in which the communities who have such an experience in education, employment, housing, and with the criminal justice system have no different experience or expectations from the health service. And so it is an issue of trust. And I think it's one where we have to listen and we have to hear and we have to look at our strategies. We need to have trusted sources within communities that are talking to people about their concerns and about the vaccination. We do need to address the issues of access. There seems to be certainly evidence in London that people are having difficulty in accessing the vaccine at a time that suits them, and more vaccine hubs within communities much closer to where people are. And we need to tailor a communication. Our communication and the way the mediums media within which we are communicating and types of messages is still not really good enough, and we should be learning from previous experience about that. So I think we have much to improve, and it's a question of listening and understanding what the concerns are.
Nikki?
Yes, if I could just add, I absolutely support what Jane has said. I think the question was about what are we doing, and absolutely echo Jane. If I could just add something we're doing within the kidney community, is we recognise with regards to research, for example, that we have to undertake the type of research that I would call it co-produced. So in other words, we have a group of people who are living with kidney disease, who are from all sorts of different communities, and we develop the research with them. So those of you who are familiar with research, it's about identifying the research question. It's possibly around people who are living with kidney disease. We're thinking about they themselves interviewing other people with kidney disease. So it's not research where we do things to people, and I think that's been part of the issue in terms of trust in the past. So we're trying to readdress all these things to ensure that we're not only listening, but we're involving people in the taking part. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for your answers there. Got a question here in regards to what about vaccinating children, as well as there was another question here in regards to why is COVID-19 less severe for children? Just wanted to pick up on that question just because it's quite, with all the vaccinations that have currently gone out, over 12 million vaccinations have gone out at this time for people that are over a certain age and in healthcare professions. There's no real push on vaccinating children at this time. So is there anyone that can address this at this time? Brian, Iman?
Yeah, so there are differences definitely between adults and children. For example, the age-related damage in what we call the endothelial cells everywhere in the vascular system, and also the clotting function, it changes with age. These are some of the reasons I've read about. Additionally, the density and the affinity by which the virus binds to the angiotensin converting enzymes to receptors. These are the receptors to which the virus binds. The density and the affinity of this binding is different between adults and children. And also, it could be lower levels of vitamin D. That was one of the reasons I've, in adults versus children, one of the reasons I've read about. And the prevalence of higher percentages of comorbidities in adults versus children. So you find like more adults with type 2 diabetes and with cardiovascular disease and with renal problems than you find in children. And some also, I've read for children that children are getting already several vaccines, and these vaccines could have what we call an off-target effect that could be also protective somehow to the coronavirus. So it's the mode of infection and the density of the receptors and probably the off-target effects also by different vaccines that the children get. So this, I don't know if any of the colleagues would like to add anything.
I'd just add a couple of comments. I think we don't know all the answers yet. As I said, it's very early.
Exactly.
It's quite clear that children seem to have been less badly affected generally. And the government's priority, as is stated in their rollout plan, is to save lives and prevent severe infections first. So the rollout plan is quite clearly targeted at the most at-risk people. And I don't think anyone's arguing with that. But as we move on, hopefully we'll learn more about why there are differences, not just between children, but between adults with different comorbidities.
Very much. both for your answers there. I'll move on now onto a question we have that says, how do we speak to a person who has had bad side effects of the COVID-19 vaccine to encourage their own family members to take the vaccine? And it's sort of like a question that refers to pretty much what people are also afraid of taking vaccines in terms of getting side effects. Maybe if they're allergic as well, they could probably develop an allergic reaction to the vaccine. What is something that we could address in that regards, in that sense, in regards to side effects, allergic reactions, in regards to vaccines that are being developed right now? Iman or Brian or?
Well, is it a communications question, or do we need to try and understand what side effects we're talking about? Because I don't think there are very many documented side effects yet. Most of the side effects are sort of sore arms and possibly flu-like symptoms, but when you're vaccinating this many people, you're bound to see one or two things, and I don't think there's been very many reports of difficulties yet. But then if there are, or if there have been, how do you communicate it was the initial question. And I think some of the other presenters have touched on that already.
Yeah, Nikki?
Yes, I'll answer. I think the first thing is about communicating the number of people who might have had side effects, and what some people might consider is not a big side effect, like a sore arm, for example. For other people, that might be quite a big thing. So I think we have to be clear about that, first of all. And, you know, maybe we've had whatever it is now, 12 or whatever it is, 11 million vaccines. And there was an issue with the anaphylaxis in the early days. Again, I'm not party to the actual numbers, but I know that's a very, very small number. And that's why people have to be observed for 15 minutes after having the vaccine. But in terms of having a sore arm or flu-like symptoms, then of course that's many, many more people. So I think we have to be transparent about that. That's the first thing. In terms of communication, I think it's always about the benefit and the risk, isn't it? And certainly people with kidney disease that I've chatted to who've had the vaccine, from their side, it's well, I won't say a no-brainer, but this idea that, okay, a sore arm and having a flu-like symptom for 48 hours compared with having COVID and the real possibility of dying from COVID, for them, you know, the benefit and the risk is completely outweighed. But I understand for other people, it's not quite as clear-cut as that.
And I think that's a good point, Nicola, because that benefit-risk balance is exactly what the regulator looks at before approving anything.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that. Got a question here that says, do you think there should be a better public health campaign to inform people about the vaccines? And if so, what would they involve or include within the campaigns that would entice people to, well, we encourage people to have a better outlook on vaccines in that sense? Jane?
Yes, I think there are lessons that we've learned from previous vaccination campaigns and the concerns that occurred about childhood vaccinations. We need to address the concerns that are being raised here in the chat about efficacy. Does it work? What are the benefits to me if I have it and to the people that matter to me? And what are the costs associated? And as Nikki's just described, the costs in terms of side effects are few and not that serious. The benefits to an individual are not immediately apparent. They are, if you like, psychological in knowing that I am now protected against serious disease, but also certainly the evidence seems to be from WHO and in many countries that the public health message needs to promote you are helping others, and that it's part of our social responsibility to become vaccinated. And I think we're lagging a bit behind in our public health message here and about how we're communicating. There was so much enthusiasm that science had accelerated the development of the vaccine and that this would help us all out of the last year and the pandemic. And we haven't addressed the concerns that people genuinely have about this, and particularly also about the speed in which the development, and perhaps, as I said earlier, what we know is the case with this vaccine, and what we don't yet know. And to be straightforward and transparent about what we don't know, but what we don't know is not as serious or as much of a concern as the benefits that we already do know, if I can put that right. Sound like Donald Rumsfeld here.
Thank you, Jane. I've got a question here for Ali. Did any of your respondents mention about the COVID-19 vaccine, such as they wish they had it to prevent their experiences, or would advocate getting the vaccine?
There was a lot of our participants, they did have messages at the end about the public. They wish the public would take it seriously. There were a lot of comments made about that. And I haven't had anything about the vaccine so far, but they were saying that they wish people would stay home and realise that the side effects that can happen with COVID. Yeah. Fair
enough. Maybe got enough time for 2 questions, so I'm just going to pick one from the quick Q&A box now. It says, one sec, let me just quickly get one here. Is there research being done on immunity after having COVID-19? What are the experiences of SARS in that respect? Is that envisioned that people will need to be vaccinated after recovery? Would that be something we could address? Brian, you look.
Yeah, in terms of people who've had COVID, there's no reason not to be vaccinated, because that would maybe act like a bit like a booster. So you'd actually potentially, all you would do is increase the immunity. We don't know all the answers. We don't know how long immunity after having had COVID would last for at the moment, and people are looking at that. So there's more to be learned about that. I wouldn't be able to give you a definitive answer, but the general impression is that you wouldn't turn down a vaccine just because you'd had COVID.
Okay, that's fine. And then there's another question here in regards to people that have already been vaccinated. For instance, is there a possibility if someone already been vaccinated with, for instance, the Pfizer vaccine, can get the South African variant of the vaccine? And that's something as well to touch on in terms of the amount of mutations this virus has gone on in that sense. Is that something that it'd probably be a bigger, wider talk to discuss that, because obviously it's such a new virus, new vaccine, as well as new variants are coming out all the time? Is that something that we can try and discuss here for the last few minutes of the event?
Well, I can say that there are studies underway looking at following up the first jab with one vaccine by using a different vaccine and seeing whether that has effect. That will go on to, if you're looking at these sort of minor modifications of a couple of these vaccines to address the variants, which is work underway. That will take months again to get those out. But in the end, we may be looking at, as we are with some of the existing vaccines, of having a vaccine that contains several actives that are active against different strains particularly. So there's work going on along those lines. But we'll try and move as fast as the virus does. And as I say, from that viewpoint, it's early days yet. But we hope we will have vaccines that will address all the variants.
Thank you, Brian. Before we finish today, I just want to ask all the panelists to give a few words in regards to the vaccination process going forward. It's going to be a long road going forward in terms of the whole UK being vaccinated, and just wanted to go through your thoughts for this time. So start with Jane, see if a few thoughts.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you all for your really detailed questions, and obviously the level of interest amongst the audience. There is a, Josephine posted lately in the chat about, since there is so much that we don't know, who should we trust then? And I understand the skepticism that some people may have, but from a public health perspective, my final words would be that vaccination is not new. And the vaccinations that we're talking about now are not new science. They've been in development for a very long period of time. For this particular virus, it's new, but the process is not new. And it has had an enormous impact over the last decades in removing, as Iman was showing, polio, smallpox, which were deadly in my lifetime.
Thank you, Jane. Iman, do you want to say a few words?
Just want to say that, first of all, thanks everyone for their interest and the questions. I believe that based on today's presentations and all our knowledge, previous knowledge, as also Jane said, the process is the same, and the pandemics will not going to be ending with COVID-19. So there is no, for me, I'm talking about myself, although we still do not know a lot about COVID-19 and about the side effects and everything, but as somebody who belongs to the BAME community, I would take the vaccine because the benefits are definitely more than the risks.
Thank you, Iman.
I'm talking about myself.
Thank you. Brian, you want to share a few words?
Yes, I think that the government's clearly put a lot behind vaccination as part of the way out of this pandemic and to get the country open again. None of us wants to be locked down for much longer than we need to. So I would recommend that we would sign up to the vaccine. I would take it. I've got elderly relatives who've already had the first jab. As Jane says, the process of vaccination, the principles are not new. We are vaccinating at a scale that we've never tried to do before in as short a time as possible. And I think we should support the government in its rollout plans.
Thank you, Brian. Ali?
My response would just be regarding when you are receiving WhatsApp messages or social media aspects that are saying things about vaccines or about COVID, is just do your own research. So rather than just pressing that forward button and sending it round to your community, actually just have a look and see if you can find out where that actually come from and whether that's correct. Because otherwise you're sending misinformation to people. So just spend some time just going on to Google, having a look at the World Health Organization, for example. What are they saying about what the information that's been sent to you?
Amazing, Ali, thank you. And last but not least, Nikki.
Yes, thank you, Dean. I suppose my closing words are very much we should listen to each other. We should really listen to what people's concerns are, and try and talk it through with individuals and families. We should trust people who are within communities, people who've had the vaccine. They can talk about their experiences. And just to answer a couple of practical questions people have asked about fertility and allergy, what I suggest is you go on to, again, I'm sorry, Google, you have to be IT literate, but go on and really understand from people who are experts in allergy, experts in fertility, and see what they're saying about it. I think that will help you.
Amazing, thank you, Nikki. And this concludes today's event. I would like to take this time to thank all speakers to give us their insights, knowledge and research, as well as for all of you for your interaction throughout the event today. I hope you will have a bit more of an understanding regarding vaccine development ahead of the full rollout of the COVID-19 vaccines to the public here in the UK. With all new updates and information coming out daily, make sure you keep up to date with the latest findings and the research that is being done, being discovered in the fight towards COVID-19. For the time being, stay safe and good evening.